Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Accessibility in Canvas workshop. I am Jess Dewey. I'm a STEM teaching consultant with Learning Innovation and Lifetime Education, and I will be running you through the content for today. We have a few goals to get through, so by the end of this session, we would like you to be able to define accessibility, explain why accessibility is important, set up your Canvas course site in an accessible way, and use a couple of different tools to help resolve common accessibility issues that you might find in your course. To start, we want to make sure we have a common definition of accessibility. And the definition that we'll be using today is making information, activities, and/or environments sensible, meaningful, and usable for as many people as possible. And the way that we want to do this is through equitable, responsible design. So that encompasses a lot, but it really just means making sure that everybody can participate in as many ways as that works for them. We're going to focus broadly on accessibility and what that means and how to work towards it. And then later on, we will focus more in how to make Canvas accessible and how to work in Canvas in an accessible way. One framework that we're using to guide this session is called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. UDL is a design theory that is rooted in accessibility, and it focuses on how different types of expression, representation, and engagement work better for different individual students. Essentially, that means we want to give students multiple ways to learn and express their learning through the design of your course. So the goal here is to work on changing the design of your learning environment to be accessible to all learners, rather than asking learners to fit a specific approach to learning in your course. So when we think of accessibility, some of the more common examples that you might hear or see or have had in your courses could include having blind or motion impaired students. And so for those students, you might use larger text in your materials or make sure that your materials are accessible to a screen reader. If you have students who are neurodiverse, you might work to provide more structure in your course, or you might give time and location accommodations for assignments or exams. And finally, you might have second language learners or deaf students in your courses. And so things you might do for them include using captions, mics, and higher volumes. But we want to remember that these are only a couple of examples of folks that have accessibility needs, and there are a lot of other types of accessibility needs that this design includes. So we want to always be thinking about additional ways that we can make our courses accessible. We also want to think about how these types of actions you might take are useful for everyone, regardless of ability. So I can hear just fine, but I always use captions when I watch the television because it just helps me process that information. And if you're providing more structure in your course, that's going to be useful for everyone. That won't harm any of the learners in your courses. So we always want to be thinking about how we can implement these types of actions in our course to be helpful for everybody. We also want to think about how accessibility needs might not always be permanent. They could be temporary or situational. So you might have students who come in with an injury and just are unable to type in the way that they were previously. So you might have to think about those accessibility needs for a temporary period of time. And situational accessibility needs exist too. So if you have students who are studying in a space that is not quiet, they might not be able to listen to a video. Or if they are in a quiet space, they might not be able to listen to a video. So having captions on videos, for example, is a good way to make that situation accessible. So we always want to really be thinking about how we can make everything as accessible as possible to account for as many situations as we can think of. And another reason for doing so is that this helps shift the responsibility away from individual students needing to make accommodation requests and potentially out their disabilities to you in order to get the accessibility needs that they require. If you do get accommodation requests, make sure that you're honoring them, but as much work as we can do from the beginning, from the ground up, to make things accessible, it takes the onus off students in that way. So now we want to think about, why are these principles important in Canvas? So if you're using Canvas as your learning management system, you don't have a different website for students to go to, Canvas is going to be the one-stop shop where they are finding all of your course content and completing all of their assessments. So because all of your course content is going to be organized there, and that's where students are going to access content and assessments, it's really important to make sure all of that is accessible to your students. A really good reason for this as well is that if you reduce students' work in navigating your course site and in accessing your course materials, it allows them to spend more of their effort and time on learning your content, which is what we want. So they don't have to worry about finding things, they can focus on learning. Now, some of the beginning steps for thinking about designing an accessible course site are some of our best practices that you might have heard in our previous workshops. The first one is using a Canvas homepage. So we suggest setting up a homepage as an easy landing spot for important information. That might be your course description, your name and contact information, etc. And depending on how you set it up, you can also use your homepage as a guide or a navigation tool for students. So the great thing here is that everything that they would need to really work in your course and figure out where things are, and know how to go and navigate your course site, the homepage can work really well for this, and it's one spot. Going along with that homepage, we suggest using the modules tool, because it's another great way to clearly organize your site and your content for students. So from your homepage, you could send them to the modules tool, and then in the modules tool could be all of your course content organized in a really great way. And this helps provide guidance for students to find what they need when they need it throughout the semester. So both of these practices are really just reducing the effort it takes for students to find your course content. And again, then they can focus on learning. When we start to move away from the foundations of designing your site to thinking about your content and applying UDL to your content, we're going to focus on one aspect of the UDL framework, which is providing multiple means of representation of your course content. That means that you're providing students with multiple ways to access your content, whether that would be through text or images, video, or audio. When you are providing students with these multiple means of representation, you're giving them more ways to access and learn your content. But for each of these different things, each of these different representations, there are accessibility principles to follow. So we're going to go through a couple of examples of that next. So when we think about sharing text or readings, the first thing we'll think about here is using headings. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a piece of text. It's outlined in red and it has an exclamation point symbol. It has some information, and you'll see that different pieces of information are in different lines, and it looks like there might be headings, but it's all the same size, it's all the same font, color, etc. It's hard to really parse that visually and figure out what's the most important information and how is it organized. When we move to the right-hand side for the text that's outlined in green with the check mark, you'll see that it's a lot easier to visually parse out the information. You'll see now what the title is and where the different sections of that information are. Um, so one way you could think about doing this, and it might look like this is just the way it was done, is text size, color, bolding, etc. But we actually don't want to use that. We want to use headings instead. So headings are specific styles that are incorporated into programs like Google Docs and Word Doc, that are actually screen reader accessible. So that means that when a student with a screen reader goes to access this information, the screen reader will recognize title, heading 1, heading 2, etc. And that will help students using screen readers to navigate through that material. If you only use text size and bold and color, for example, those things are not recognized by a screen reader, and so those students will not be able to sort through the information as well. So we want to make sure that we are using headings whenever we are creating any written content. You'll be able to do that in, again, programs like Google Doc and Word Doc, as well as in the Canvas Rich Content Editor. Another way that we think about sharing content with students is with links, because they might be links to readings that you want students to access for your course. And there are best practices for accessibility here as well. So at the very top, the first example is probably one of the more common things we see, where we have some text that says, "See also Native Americans in the United States." And below that, the entire URL for a web page is pasted. Now, visually, this isn't super nice, but especially for students who are using screen readers, what happens when you just paste a link like this is that the screen reader will start reading out the entire URL as https colon backslash, etc. So this is really not accessible for students that are using a screen reader. So you want to make sure that we're using hyperlinks, where you make the text itself a clickable link. And then when you start doing that, another common example we see is that you create some text that says click here, and that becomes your hyperlink. So it's a little bit better than just a full URL, but this still really isn't accessible because screen readers will take all the hyperlinks in a document and make a list of them for students to sort through when they're using the screen reader. So it takes it out of context. And when it takes it out of context, a student using the screen reader might see 5 different links that say click here, but they don't know what they're navigating to. So the best accessibility practices here would be the example on the bottom, where you have that same text that says, "See also Native Americans in the United States," but the second portion of that statement is your hyperlink. So then students know exactly where they're navigating when they see that link. So this is really good practice. It does take some practice to get used to doing, but we just really want to focus on making the descriptive text, our hyperlinks, to be as accessible as possible. Next, we want to talk about images and making images as accessible as possible. And so the best way to do this is using alternative text or alt text. So whenever you paste an image into any kind of document editing program or the rich content editor, you want to make sure you add alt text, which is text that's associated with the picture but doesn't necessarily show up on the screen unless the image does not load itself. And the alt text is important for screen readers specifically, so that students who are using screen readers who cannot visually see the image will get the information that they need from that image. So a couple of poor examples of alt text might be if you just write banner or just as the alt text, because that doesn't really give any information about what is in the image itself. Another thing that we want to stay away from is writing image of something in the alt text, because screen readers do recognize images. So if a screen reader reads it, it will say image of campus. So it's a little repetitive. You'll see a couple of examples on the right-hand side in green, but what I want to focus on here is how context really matters when you're writing alt text. So for example, if I have this image pasted somewhere and I'm just using it as a link to a website, then my alt text should say Duke Learning Innovation and Lifetime Education website. So we know where that's navigating. If it's not a link to anywhere, but it's just an image, and what I want people to know is the text on the image itself, then maybe my alt text would just be Duke Learning Innovation and Lifetime Education, because that's what is on the image. That's all I need people to know. So that's what I would leave it as. But let's say I might be in an art class and I want the alt text to be something about the contrast of the text over the image. I want a little bit more detail about the picture itself in the background. My alt text might be white text over an image of Duke campus at sunset. So it's a little bit more descriptive about what's actually present in the image. And the big thing here is that what you want to make sure you're doing is you're setting it up so somebody who can't visually see the image and is using a screen reader gets the same experience and information from that image as a sighted student. So again, this takes practice, but just start making sure that every image you use has some alt text associated and you're pulling out as much information as possible to provide descriptive alt text. A couple of other notes here. If you have any images in your course site or in your content that are really just decorative, they're not adding anything to your content, it's not required for a student to understand what you're trying to teach, then you can mark an image as decorative. And this can be done in a lot of different programs where you would put alt text in. Often there is a box that you can check that says this is a decorative image. And then we also want to think about alt text versus captions. So alt text, as I said earlier, doesn't visually display on a page unless an image doesn't load. But captions, like you might have for graphs in a paper, for example, do show up visually on a page. So if you have an image that comes along with a caption, you can try to figure out if that caption captures everything that a student might need to know about the image. But if you're ever in doubt, it's best to use both captions and alt text to make sure that students are getting the full context of an image, even if it's a little repetitive. Okay. And then the last piece of content we're going to talk about how to make accessible is if you're using video or audio content in your course. So adding captions is going to be your best bet for if you have any video content that you're using in your course. If you have videos from the internet, you want to make sure that they have captions associated with them. So like this is a screenshot of a YouTube video. You'll see that the caption says music playing. So you want to make sure that there's captions on any videos that you share. Similarly, if you have audio files like podcasts that you want students to listen to for your course, make sure that there's an associated transcript for that podcast, as this is necessary for deaf students who need that those written versions of the content to learn. But it's also useful for other people who might just process better by learning than by listening, or reading than by listening, excuse me. If you are recording your own content, it's best to use a program that will produce captions. So this might be Zoom. Panopto is a really good option as well for recording content. And then YouTube will also produce its own captions as well. So if you're recording content, just make sure that you're using a program that produces those captions and transcripts. But as you use programs that automatically produce those captions, you want to make sure that you go back and review them for accuracy, especially if you're in a field that has a lot of jargon. Sometimes those programs do not pick up words correctly. So you want to make sure they produce the captions, but then go back and check them for accuracy as well. And then finally, for anything that you're sending students that has audio, you want to make sure that that audio is good quality. It's something that most students will be able to hear, just to make sure that, again, that's as accessible as possible.